I propose that this new region of our land, now parts of Nebraska and Kansas territories, be set aside, and to call the new place Tohosa Territory, land of the mountain people.
Opportunity abounds in this place. The mountains, streams, rivers, and plains offer each and every person his own space. Prospectors are discovering rich bounties of gold in the streams as I speak. The men are scouring the mountains for the mother lode. The region's vast forests will yield endless timber for generations to come. The melting mountain snow waters the entire continent. Rich valley bottom soils invite unheralded production. Already farmers are growing potatoes that weigh not 4 pounds, but 40 pounds each. Set against a vast blue sky, the majestic purple mountains invite hunting, fishing, or simply vacationing. A number of hot springs hold the promise of healing. Dry, clean air seems to cure all who ail. Tohosa Territory, land of ever and equal opportunity.
And they came. The greatest migration in the history of the United States began. First, the gold hunters came by the dozens, then by the hundreds, then by the tens of thousands to bountiful Tohosa Territory. Nothing stopped the tide of immigrants. Adventurers headed for a new life in the West. They left homes in Michigan, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. They boarded ships in Europe for a land far away. They traveled across the world to an international rendezvous to the land of ever and equal opportunity. The pioneers paved paths that led far beyond the horizon. They pushed people like themselves to follow their passions. They stretched the frontiers of an expanding land. And just when the West seemed won, Tohosans set their sights on outer space. They built the machines that put man on the moon.
Such opportunity breeds character. Tohosan characters are tough. For every millionaire, there were thousands who grubbed for every penny they earned. This rugged breed, full of courage, physical endurance, intelligence, loyalty, and love, built Colorado.
The Mosh family, full of Colorado characters, represents the force of the Tohosa Territory's families. The Mosh family story is like opening a book about Colorado history and having it come to life, told by those who wrote it. The persistent pioneering spirit still prevails in a land where family pride soars higher than eagles over the Front Range. We are all richer for having known these wonderful characters who have passed through our lives. first of the family came from Wisconsin by wagon train. John C. Rash and his wife and family arrived in Denver in 1860. By 1862, Rash had broken ground along the South Platte River bottomlands for a dairy farm. Opportunity teased Eastern families. By 1872, the rest of the family who had settled Michigan rode west in their oxen-powered Studebaker wagons.
Tahosa's fresh air beckoned those suffering from tuberculosis and asthma. Improvements in rail transportation eased the journey to Tahosa, and more responded to the call of the West. In 1876, the Neville family rode for 7 days in a baggage car from Pennsylvania.
Later, Grandpa came out here for Grandma's health. She had asthma, and she got over the asthma.
Rosanna, her husband Edward, and the rest of the family followed their oldest daughter west. Jarvis Wild married Sarah Neville at Fort Namaqua, Mariana Medino's trading post along the Big Thompson River. Their homesteads laid around the base of Devil's Backbone, a jagged, rocky slash that cut north and south. They developed the Buckhorn Valley into cattle ranches, a fruit district, stone quarries, and a plaster-making center.
More and more folks stepped off the train onto a new home. In 1908, a tall cowboy tended his herd on a cattle train bound from Pasamonte Ranch in New Mexico to a feedlot west of Loveland called Neville's Siding. There, Ernest Bangerter met and married Cora Neville. Germans rendezvoused in Tahosa territory. 17-year-old Rudolf Gerhard von Mosch ran away from a certain future in the Prussian military. Listing his occupation as a gardener, he booked passage in 1882 on the SS Rhine in Hamburg. He sailed off to America. George walked from New York to Wisconsin, where he worked on his relative's resort. He then headed west to see the Rocky Mountains that he had read about in his school books. He found work timbering near Lake Granby. In 1890, George returned to Denver. He met Elizabeth Gebauer, a German girl who had found her way to America. They were married in the old Arapahoe County courthouse. They lived in Denver while George worked for a liquor dealer. Handsome George waited tables at the gala opening of the Brown Palace Hotel. However, the mountains beckoned. With infant son Rudolph, the family moved to Apex in Gilpin County. George worked as a timberman. All the while, he prospected for gold and establishing and selling mine claims. Sons Walt and Hans were born. Their youngest child, Elsie Mosch, was born in 1905 when the family lived in South Boulder Valley.
On the plains, under the shadow of Doubleheader Mountain, a new crop was budding. Sagebrush country was transforming into the land of white gold, sugar beets. Towns competed viciously to have a beet factory grace their industrial listings. Beet companies and farmers were desperate for field labor. On the other side of the world, a group of experienced sugar beet farmers wanted to escape the Russian czars. Konrad Lohnert and his family left Yagodania Polyana in 1902. They came through Ellis Island on their way to Wisconsin, where they joined relatives who worked for Payne's Lumber Company in Oshkosh. 6 months after arriving in America, Conrad married another beautiful immigrant from Yagoda, Marie Cook. In 1905, with one son, Conrad, Marie, and Conrad's mother and brothers came from Wisconsin to Tahosa to work the beets. State Senator William Drake, a progressive farmer, educator, and minister in Fort Collins, employed Conrad. Under Drake's tutoring, Conrad passed his naturalization test with flying colors. The Lohnert family grew. 2 sets of twins came within 2 years. By 1915, Conrad and Marie Lohnert literally had their hands full of 9 children. The last members of the family to arrive in Tahosa were Oklahoma cotton farmers. They met their relatives from Montana to farm the well-watered Bisou Creek Valley in Elbert County. When he was 16, their patriarch, Elijah Ware, had come to Tahosa in 1866. Labeling the gold rush Balderdash, he bought a horse at the famed Elephant Corral in Denver. He rode back home to Kansas, never to return. By 1918, he, his wife, and his children had purchased farms in Elbert County. Our family sought out and conquered challenges. Life was hard in the unsettled land, but even in the toughest times, our people never gave up. They seized every opportunity that Tahosa offered. They laid the foundations for all of us who followed.
Every environment breeds its own bugs. Time after time, grasshoppers swarmed through the air of Tahosa territory.
And they came across the hordes and hordes of grasshoppers where they'd come down and they'd eat every green thing in sight, just clean up everything in a day. And where it got so dark on one time when they was coming that the chickens all went to roost.
My great-grandfather, James E. Neville, tried his best to control the grasshoppers. This was in July 1896. 4 years later, the grasshoppers were gone.
Civilization cannot exist without water. The doctrine of prior appropriation dictates who can use the Tahosan water in a stream or irrigation system first.
So, how do you find underground water? Betty Moshe was a dowser. With or without divining rods, Betty could locate water wells, ore veins, and metal objects.
She says those rocks over there, if you go underneath that, so many feet, you'll have the water. So then we let her get out of the car and use her little divining rod thing, and of course it did the same thing that she just told me. They drilled a well there and hit it right to the foot, right in that spot.
Miners and farmers altered Tahosan watercourses to wash out gold and to irrigate fields. The first ditch dug in 1860, the Brantner, to divert water out of the South Platte River, ran along John C. Rash's property. The Elkhorn Ditch, now called the Brighton Ditch, was dug in 1863. It took out on Rash's property. In Larimer County, the Neville family owned water rights in the Loudon Ditch. They also owned the two Neville ditches along the Buckhorn Creek west of Loveland. Ditches are not safe places to play. Many Tahosan children drowned in the ditches. The Lahnert children wouldn't resist the temptation of those ditches, so their parents scared them to death.
When they lived on the farm, there were huge irrigation ditches. And a lot of the babies, apparently children, were drowned in these ditches. So my father took a board and patted it and threw it in the ditch and told my children, or his children, that that was a baby that was drowned. And so that put the fear of God into them, so they stayed away from the ditch after that.
Moshe family members worked on major Front Range water diversion projects. The Moffett Tunnel water bore was the pilot tunnel. When the Moffett was completed, the pilot bore was turned into an aqueduct. Water from Middle Park Reservoir flows through the bore to Denver. In the 1930s, Hans Moshe worked on the water bore. Later, Hans worked on the Gross Dam, which holds water in South Boulder Creek. One day was a close call.
Dad had another close call when he was working on this dam up here. It was a powder monkey. The whole crew blew up. We went up there loading them holes. One day, this day I laid off. And that's the day that they hooked up all of their shots, you see. Electricity set it off and killed the whole damn crew, all 9 of them. If I'd have worked that day, I'd have gotten killed up there.
My father, Delbert L. Harold, worked for the Bureau of Reclamation from 1943 to 1969, first as a heavy equipment operator and then as a mechanic. He helped excavate most of the major reservoir basins for the Big Thompson project including Green Mountain, Granby, Shadow Mountain, Carter Lake, Flatirons, and Horsetooth reservoirs, as well as the dams and canals connected with them. During his final 10 years with the Bureau of Reclamation, he worked as a power plant mechanic at the Estes Park Power Plant.
Tahosan streams are notoriously unpredictable. Floods have always been Tahosa's bane. In 1864, Tahosan streams overflowed their banks. Denver was devastated when Cherry Creek rampaged through town.
And the water down to Denver, the Cherry Creek water, had waves on it that sounded like the waves of an ocean. And Fort Collins was the only place in the country that was dry land. So they put that fort up there at Fort Collins. That's how it came to be where it is now.
The floods continued year after year. In 1894, the Big Thompson ripped out the Loveland Water Supply Dam. Moshe family ancestral matriarch Thurza Rutherford Rash loaned the water supply company $5,000 to rebuild the dam. The unique arched dam withstood the rampage of the 1976 flood of the Big Thompson. The dam is now a historic national engineering landmark. In 1976, on the eve of Tahosa's centennial celebration, the Big Thompson flood took 142 unsuspecting lives. The waters wiped out Friend Neville's 100-year-old Sylvandale Resort Ranch.
My grandmother, Cora Neville Bangerter, wrote on the back of the postcard, "The Big Dam, built in 1882. On the last day of July in 1976, my parents were preparing for a Saturday afternoon drive up the Big Thompson Canyon to Estes Park. The phone rang and some friends called to say they were stopping by the house to visit, so the drive was postponed. Thank heavens they didn't go, or they could have been among the 145 people who lost their lives in the flash flood that swept down the canyon that evening."
During the 1930s, the Midwest succumbed to a great drought. The drought broke the back of rural America. Poor agricultural methods, coupled with no rain, left the land bare. And wind stripped millions of acres of topsoil and blew it eastward. Dust clouds defied the imagination.
My parents and my father's parents lived in the western fringe of the Dust Bowl region near Fondas in Edwards County, Colorado. During that time, my mother wrote, "The weather was in a dry cycle, and only occasionally did the storm come and bring moisture, but sometimes it also brought hail. After I was born, Dad worked on construction crews. While we lived on the farm near Fondas, my mother and my grandpa worked the farm. After the worst of the drought and depression was over in 1941, World War II had begun. They sold the farm in 1942 and moved to Loveland, where my mother's parents were living.
Wherever people settle, they create a community. The Moshe family members played vital roles in many Tahosan towns. Buckhorn in Larimer County and Toland in Gilpin County were two of them.
They could have had any of the land around Denver just to homestead it. They all settled from the Buckhorn Bridge there, the mouth of the Buckhorn, about 2 miles up to the Buckhorn Dam. They bought a squatter's right to the land where the Buckhorn Dam was, and then it finally went out. All of their folks settled around there.
Toland, a water stop on the Moffett Railroad, was affectionately called Mosheville. Folks would ride up the Moffett Road to picnic and dance the Moffett two-step in the pavilion.
George Moshe was a man with dry wit who never struck it rich, but he made a legion of friends over the United States by staying in a remote place for 50 years. When George died, the mayor, police chief, fire chief, and only businessman in the ghost town of Tolland crossed over the Great Divide for the final time. The town of Tolland and George's buildings burned in a fire in 1955.
The most important part of life to many is their faith in the Lord. Moshe family members founded Christian churches throughout Tahosan communities. Conrad Leonard and his daughter Betty Leonard Moshe were very devout Christians. Both reached out to their communities as elders and lay pastors.
As we reflect once again, Lord, on Betty's life and your goodness and your blessing, and there are no more tears because you've dried them, Lord. Let us rest our hope in that.
Schools are the center of communities. Lawrence Neville, the first teacher in the family, was schoolmaster at the Stone Weldon School along the south side of the Big Thompson. Lawrence's niece, Inez Bangerter Harold, told of her first year of school at the Weldon School, the same school her mother attended.
My mother, Lawrence Neville's niece, earned her teaching certificate at the Colorado State Teachers College in Greeley. She taught in 5 different one-room schools across the state during the Depression. After World War II, she earned her bachelor's degree and returned to teach in the Washington Grade School in Loveland.
In 1956, Patricia Harold was accepted at the Colorado School of Mines. In 1968, 12 years later, married with 3 children, graduation neared. Patricia started applying for geological positions. At one interview, a man asked, "Don't you know there's a Colorado law that forbids women from working underground?" Not one professor had mentioned that. This was yet another roadblock to her chosen career. Patricia and a fellow student, Betty Gibbs, led the way to have the law repealed. Because of their determination, mine doors opened to women. Patricia Harold Moshe, the 11th woman to graduate from the Colorado School of Mines, earned 2 degrees, mining engineer and geological engineer, at the 1969 graduation.
I pledge my head to clearer thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to greater service, my health to better living, for my club, my community, my country, and my world.
My family has been involved in 4-H since I was small. Besides teaching life skills, animal husbandry, and agriculture, 4-H stresses leadership. My 4-H activities earned me a scholarship to the School of Mines. Now my daughter Susie Kiefer and her husband Freddie Kiefer serve as 4-H leaders in Larimer County.
We know what is in their heads, where their hearts are, what their hands have done, and how healthy they live. I'm grateful to hand over my community, my country, and my world to these kids. They will be in good hands.
Through William Drake's influence, the Lannert children attended grade school, not always willingly. The youngest Lannert, Florence, born in 1924, was the only one who completed high school. In Toland, the old school the most children attended in the summer still stands. Sometimes there were only 3 students, all raucous.
Moshe family members built trails, roads, and railroads. You hike on trails they created. You drive on roads they carved into the mountains.
During the Depression, my father and my uncle Eber Richards built trails in Rocky Mountain National Park for the WPA. The families camped in Estes Park during the summer months while the men worked.
Road crews turned the tide of traffic into the mountains. They paved the very path we follow.
My father helped build Raton Pass, which is the section of I-25 today at the New Mexico border. He also worked on US 34 Trail Ridge Road through Rocky Mountain National Park and in the Big Thompson Canyon. In 1937, he ran the dozer that cut the original roadbed for US Highway 40, which is today's Mount Vernon Canyon.
Railroads conquered the vast expanses of the American West. Because of its climb over Rollins Pass, the Moffett Road was one of the most challenging railways in the country. David Moffett believed a great tunnel would avoid a snowy climb. The Moffett Tunnel, completed in 1928, is the 6th longest in the world and the largest in diameter in the country.
My grandfather, George Moshe, guided the first survey crew over the path projected for the Moffett Tunnel. My father and my uncles were miners, familiar with working underground, and they worked on the construction of that tunnel.
The health of its people tells much about the state of a society. Diseases spread like prairie wildfires through Tohosa Territory. Terrors of the territory were smallpox, diphtheria, and typhoid. In 1876, 5-year-old Minnie Rutherford died of diphtheria.
Minnie got what they called membranous croup. Her father was he was out someplace, and he came home, and she stepped behind the door, and it was too much for her, and she died. She had diphtheria. They didn't know it. They called it membranous croup.
In 1884, Rosanna Neville survived a severe case of typhoid. Serious epidemics devastated entire families. In 1918, Spanish influenza claimed 50 million people around the world. In the United States, the flu's toll was 500,000. Born in Russia, Effa Lannert, mother of 4, succumbed to the flu. She died at the Fort Collins Red Cross Hospital. Public gatherings had been outlawed. Effa was buried in a mass grave in Grandview Cemetery along with other victims. Their father and grandmother raised the children.
During the peak of the 1918 influenza epidemic, my father was 7 years old. He described riding a train from Montana to Elbert, Colorado with his family. He especially remembered the huge chandelier in the Union Station in Denver. It amazed him.
More recently, rheumatic fever caused children's deaths. Alvin and Patricia Mosch both survived rheumatic fever.
Rheumatic fever took the life of my younger sister Karen Harold in 1944, despite the best efforts of the doctors at Children's Hospital in Denver. Both Karen and I were sick at the same time. My parents did not tell me she had died until 6 months later, just before I was to come home.
Colorado has always taken care of its handicapped citizens. In 1861, 12-year-old Melissa Rutherford fell off a horse. She was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Imagine life in non-accessible Colorado. However, from the confines of her wheelchair, Mel managed a cattle ranch in the Buckhorn Valley. In 1978, the Mosch family welcomed their new baby. Victor Mosch is a Down syndrome person. Born in a world where a disability is now accepted, Victor graduated from high school. He works in a sheltered workshop in Jefferson County. He particularly enjoys therapeutic horseback riding with his big pal Jake. Women do not abide domestic violence. With the full support of the courts, Mosch women confronted abuse and adultery.
My great-great-great-grandfather, Henry Rutherford, left his wife, Theresa Piper Rutherford, and 3 small children in Wisconsin, moved to Michigan, and had children by a second woman. Theresa Rutherford didn't tolerate such nonsense. She divorced Henry between 1850 and 1855. She married a neighbor, John C. Rash, in January 1858. All of Theresa's daughters and granddaughters inherited her determination. Facing up to her abusive husband, my great-grandmother Martha Elizabeth Rutherford Neville filed for divorce. She was barely 22 years old. She'd been married when she was 16. In concern for her children's future, she withdrew her request for a divorce. For 19 more years, she tolerated the abuse, raising 5 children. Finally, in 1906, she filed for divorce on the basis of cruelty. An article in the Fort Collins Weekly Courier of 1906 stated in part, "The plaintiff alleges that her husband has repeatedly struck her recently, inflicting ugly bruises." That a newspaper would report such domestic violence in this era was highly unusual. Many of my relatives and their neighbors thought this was scandalous. Finally, I realized what Grandma's sister-in-law, Lula Cox Neville, meant in a letter she wrote to Martha Rutherford Neville. Lula wrote to Martha in 1906, expressing her sympathy that Martha had to endure the agony and publicity of divorce. She ardently supported Martha's legal action against abuse.
Tahosan volunteers have served in all major global and national crises. Major conflicts of the 1860s included the Civil War and the Western Indian Wars. In 1862, Joseph Howard, Mel Rutherford's future husband, came to Tahosa with the Wisconsin 9th Light Infantry to protect Tahosa territory. First stationed at Camp Weld in Denver, he moved to Fort Lyons and was overcome with scurvy. White man's government failed to make the payments on the land they had agreed to purchase from the Indians in 1861. The natives went on a warpath. In August of 1864, the governor of Colorado Territory declared war. He called up a volunteer regiment for 100 days. On August 23, 1864, John C. Rash, 52 years old, enlisted. For a short time, Rash's company went to Latham Station to protect the stage route. Then, After ammunition and horses had come, the entire Colorado 3rd was ordered south. Rash's company was in charge of a howitzer. They carried 10 rounds of cannonballs. On November 28, 1864, the regiment, accompanied by other military units, encountered the Indians camped at Sand Creek. By noon, Rash's company ran out of ammunition. After the battle, the troops returned to Denver just before Christmas. John C. Rash mustered out 3 days later, claimed his payroll money, and with Thurza and the rest of the family, headed east to the relative safety of Fort Riley, Kansas. However, in 1870, John C. Rash returned and reclaimed his property along the South Platte. The area often suffered damage from hail, floods, and hoppers, but John C. Rash persevered. For 20 more years, he lived on his dairy farm along the River Platte. He died in 1892.
Mosh family members volunteered to fight the world in the name of democracy. At one time, Conrad Lannert bragged that he had 10 grandsons serving their country. Many were decorated for their acts of heroism.
The stock market crash of 1929 plummeted the nation into a Great Depression. No other time tried the patience and strength of Americans. During the 1930s, Florence Lannert lived in Loveland with her parents.
The Depression hit and the stock market crashed, and then my father had invested heavily in the cattle. So the owner of the farm, of course, was wealthy enough that it didn't affect him financially. But unfortunately, it did affect my father greatly. So I remember when we had the huge auction sale, and he had to auction all of the animals, the farm equipment.
The Depression created spendthrift habits in all.
For the next 2 years, he was a tenant farmer then. My mother and my father and me moved to the city of Loveland. My father went to work on a WPA project which President Roosevelt had begun after the Depression. He made $45 a month.
Settlers flowed into Tahosa, but man cannot live upon climate alone. Tahosans, experienced pioneers, made the best of their occupations. A sequence of land use unfolded. For many years, the trees that covered the mountains were there for the taking. Lumbermen clear-cut the forests, leaving the stubbles of ancient trees in their wake. For about 20 years, the Rutherford men harvested the forests, Tahosa's green gold. George Mosh worked in the lumber business in Grand and Gilpin counties for almost 20 years. The building of Moffett Railroad required rail ties. Jenkins Lumber Company opened a mill in the headwaters of South Boulder Creek under the shadow of James Peak. When the lumber rush ended, George Mosh moved his family into the nearby resort village, Tolland. Lumbering is very dangerous work. Conrad Lannert lost a finger to the saw in Wisconsin. In 1874, Henry Rutherford died in a wagon wreck at Wanderview. In 1892, Willard Rutherford slipped off the edge of Big Thompson Canyon.
Him and his daughter went to Denver to get some supplies, and as they was coming back that night, there'd been a rainstorm. They were quite close to the camp where they lived, and the horses got scared, and they ran away. Grandfather was stoned. One horse went on one side of the tree, and the other one on the other side, and Grandpa was stoned down in between, and it crushed him to death.
18 years later, Henry's brother, 71-year-old Willard Rutherford, left his son-in-law's sawmill in Rattlesnake Park.
It was the 3rd day of June, and it started to snow, and he and his son, I guess, had a kind of a quarrel about something, and he started to walk home. Well, he disappeared. That snow got pretty severe, and he never got home, and they looked for him for over a month, Uncle Friend and that old man Stevens that used to live out there. They searched the whole country, but nobody ever found the old man.
Rutherford's skeleton was found 46 years later.
He had a sore leg, ulcer on his leg, and he had a double-bitted axe, and he had this bottle of salve in his pocket. Well, he was found up here right close to Mount Rosian, but he might have come to a place where there was a drop-off, and he had cut several sticks, for use for cane, and he probably came to this place, and during that snowstorm, when he couldn't see, he had dropped off down in there. Maybe it caved in and buried him.
Mosch family ancestors began farming in Tahosa in 1862. Alfred Wild and his brothers were master farmers. They turned the floodplain soil along the Big Thompson into prime farmland.
Tahosa's vast expanse of prairie grasslands was grazing lands. The Buckhorn Valley and the hills to the west formed a vast pasture. During roundups, brands identified the animals. In 1887, the state issued the first official brand book. To ensure that they would have an income should something happen to their husbands, women had their own branded herds. Roundups ended when railroads and fences crossed property lines.
Like other settlers along the Front Range, the pioneers of the Buckhorn planted fruit trees.
For approximately 35 years, my grandmother, Cora Neville Bangader, with the help of her immediate family, produced enough cherries from her 10-acre orchard to support her family. Grandma operated the only cherry stand on the main highway from Loveland to Estes Park. She also sold soda pop, cigarettes, chewing tobacco, and Neville's pure fruit cider. The cherry industry met its demise from a blight in the 1950s. Nothing remains today of the hard work of the Loveland fruit farmers. Today my daughter Cindy and her family live in part of what was the cherry orchard.
Colorado led the nation in sugar beet production. Sugar beets require constant care, planting, thinning, irrigating, hoeing, and harvesting. Americans enticed German and Russian immigrants to work the fields.
Beet children worked the fields alongside their parents. The National Council for Child Labor frowned on such hard work by children. The council hired social photographer Lewis Hine to document children working. During the fall of 1915, Hine traveled through Tahosa. On Halloween Day, he photographed 12-year-old Alex Lannert topping beets. It served as ammunition in the fight for the national child labor laws. Of the 10 Lannert children that survived, 4 went into farming. Immigrant women and their daughters toiled alongside men and sons in the beet fields. Many of their daughters grew up determined to be off the farm. They hired out as nannies or worked as sales clerks. During World War II, they worked the bomb factories and at military bases. They set the standard for women in the Western labor force. During her career with the Air Force, Florence Lannert received many awards for superior performance. In 1988, she received the prestigious Outstanding Civil Service Career Service Award.
The family mining tradition began with George Mosch's Gold Run Mine along South Boulder Creek. George's 3 sons became hard rock miners. They worked in over 100 mines in the Front Range. The Glory Hole in Central City was probably the most famous. Hans Mosch worked in the Glory Hole twice. After the Second World War started, all effort went towards the war machine. The War Board passed L-208, which shut down all gold and silver mines. Only mines that produced materials needed in the war could operate. It was impossible for independent miners to obtain materials for mining. One time, the 3rd-generation Mosch miners showed their elders how to find gold.
I'm Dave Mosch. I grew up in the Clear Creek County area. Well, the Wheatland, it was a small prospect. I really wouldn't call it a mine because even though it actually did send a little bit of mineral to the smelter, it never made any money. They had a lot of ore, if you want to call it ore. The definition of ore is that it makes money. Well, none of it ever made any money, but it was sure pretty. And Thomas Cooper, a very good prospector. At one point in time, he had to make a living, of course, so he could finance his prospecting ventures. A flash flood came down Trail Creek and literally scoured decaying into bedrock. As he examined bedrock, he encountered a little vein. He was able to pick out pieces of gold out of the vein, and the story goes that he collected it and then took a trip to Central City where he sold it. The point is that there was this very rich vein. He covered it up because he didn't own the land. That land was staked and actually became patented by somebody else. My sisters and I were actually prospecting near the portal of the old mine, the Phoenix. But it was kind of neat because you could take an oxidized rock that no longer had the pyrite in it, and you could take little pieces of rock, chip them off the vein, go down the creek with a mortar and pestle, powder up the ore, put it in a gold pan and pan it. You'd see the gold pieces. My sisters and I would do this for friends and show people, we were quite popular because we could actually show people what gold looked like. Because of that, we kids actually had all found it, but they gave me the credit because I was the one that realized that there was a difference, that it had to be a new vein. I actually became quite famous for a while, which I thought was crazy. It was fun. It was really fun to actually go out there and see that. But yeah, that's all stems from people's perception. What people don't realize is that mining is not an easy game. Mining is a very difficult thing to do.
Two other metals used in steel manufacturing contribute to Tahosa's economy: tungsten and molybdenum. Tungsten-bearing minerals occur in fissures in granite within western Boulder County. Modern milling techniques included electromagnetic separators that separated steel tungsten from its ore. Colorado still leads the nation in molybdenum production.
Very efficient operation, very environmentally friendly. There were at least 3 other drifts where they were unable to actually utilize them as production drifts. They were literally collapsing, caving in. When I say caving in, it's not like you would think where the rock just collapses. This is where the rock was actually squeezing in. And a 10 foot by 10 foot drift was now like only an 8 foot by 8 foot drift.
Many other materials from the earth are necessary for human existence. Sandstone makes fine buildings and paving materials. Most family members operated sandstone quarries along Buckhorn Creek at Arkins. Plaster is made from gypsum. Gypsum occurs in the valley between the Hogback and the Front Range.
Colorado's most important mineral resource is oil shale. Billions of gallons are tied up in rocks on the western slope. For over 100 years, the shales have been promoted as potential oil reserves.
I became one of the first female geologists working for a major oil shale company at Tosco, where I specialized in oil shale reserves both in the United States and around the world. Mining is one of the world's most dangerous occupations. Rock falls, cave-ins, and other accidents take many lives. Another mine danger is underground water. For a period of time, the Argo Tunnel between Idaho Springs and Central City was the longest mine tunnel in Colorado, over 4 miles in length. Samuel Newhouse started the Argo in 1893, but it didn't carry ore until 1908.
When that Argo, when they killed all them guys there with that flood there, Idaho Springs, I just missed that by 2 days. They wanted me to quit my job and go down there. It was back over 4 miles in the tunnel. When they blasted, the water got to them before they could ever make the main tunnel.
Before dry drills were outlawed, miners died of miners' consumption. The medical term is silicosis, or hardening of the lungs from breathing dust particles.
Al Mosch has spent much of his career fighting for the rights of small miners. The battle continues.
In 1961, President Kennedy challenged the nation to put man on the moon. Tahosans engineered much of the space program. Alvin and David Mosch both worked in the aerospace industry. However, Betty Mosch, a 62-year-old simple woman who knew nothing about rocketry, played the most unique role. The story of Betty's involvement in the eventful flight of Apollo 13 is told in the Kennedy Space Center.
My grandmother, originally she just moved from Boulder. A lot of people wanted to call her a psychic, but she would never call herself that because that was definitely not something a Christian would be able to be as a psychic. But she still knew things she wasn't supposed to know, things that would happen in the future. Apollo 13 was an amazing event. My father's career and potential life was on the line because he was the inspector who inspected the tank that blew up on Apollo 13. So she was pretty emotionally involved in us. And she was able to, during the Apollo 13, to know things about what's going on with the spacecraft. Things that even the scientists and the engineers at NASA didn't know. For example, she knew exactly how many correction firings the retro rockets on the spacecraft would have to make to get its orbit changed to head back to Earth. She knew that one of the astronauts was actually going to have a cold when he got back to Earth. She knew hundreds of details about what was going to happen. Initially, my father would relay the information to the engineers, and they would call the folks at NASA and say, hey, there's this lady up here, this is what she's saying, and so far she's been saying everything right. And it's kind of dumbfounding us. We can't believe that she actually knows this stuff. Pretty soon people down at NASA were actually calling her directly. For Apollo 13, I don't know why she was doing this or what meaning it would have. NASA gave her 100% rating when she was done. She had no errors, none. They actually called her for Apollo 14. And in Apollo 15, she said, I don't want to do this anymore.
Al Mosch was relieved when the inspection revealed that the tank had been damaged after it left Boulder. Often called the Switzerland of America, Tohosa Territory is blessed with spectacular alpine scenery. The first tour of business in the family was friend Neville's Sylvandale Dude Ranch. Friend rented cabins at the base of the Big Thompson Canyon to fishermen and hunters. He taught folks how to ride horses, brand calves, fish, and to eat barbecue.
My grandfather, George Mosch, he purchased 6 cabins in Tolan to rent to fishermen and hunters. At the pool hall, Grandma made sandwiches and sold bait, tackle, and postcards.
Al Mosch operates the historic Phoenix Gold Mine Tour outside of Idaho Springs, where mining history comes alive.
In 1988, I started this mine tour business as a favor to a friend. Now it's so busy. Visitors come from all the world. I guess I've become the history now.
Central City, one of the oldest towns in Tohosa, has always attracted tourists. Along one street, you hear the sounds of culture. Down the other street, the sounds of good old-fashioned good times. Elsie Mosch and her sister-in-law, Mattie Mosch, dominated the scene in Central City.
The fairy tale face on the floor of the Teller House has always been shrouded in mystery. Artist Herndon Davis painted the beautiful portrait. The year was 1936. Central City Opera Association had hired the artist to paint historical sketches of the town. Davis stayed in the Teller House. The evening of July 2nd, he strolled into the bar of the Teller House. Beautiful Elsie Mosch was enjoying a drink on her bar stool. The artist asked if he can paint her. Always wanted to have fun, Elsie said, "Why, certainly." She focused her big brown eyes on him. Her face ended up on the floor. In Tohosan style, many myths have been concocted about the painting. The artist's wife denied to her dying day that it was her. The media insisted it was. An operatic actress claimed it was her. Some say it was baby doe Tabor. Others say it was her daughter, Silver Dollar Tabor. The model for the face was a beautiful Gilpin County girl, never revealed except by Elsie Mosch to relatives and to Gilpin County Deputy Sheriff Dave Oakes.
Approximately 30 years ago, it had been about maybe this time of year in 1975, I'd met Elsie at her cabin in Tolan. She told me that she was the face on the barroom floor. I don't know what led to that conversation other than she did tell me that. I had no reason not to believe her.
After waiting tables all day in the town cafe, the 76-year-old waitress sang with piano players at the saloons around the town. Mattie was known around the world. Mattie died in 1967. Her funeral was at St. James Methodist Church. Saloon owners thought so highly of Mattie that they had a bust of her crafted of concrete. The bust was stolen by vandals, but later recovered. It was played in a position of honor above the bar at the Gilded Garter Saloon. During renovations in 1992, someone threw it in the dumpster.
We change, but we don't change. We dream on, but don't look back. Through trying Tahosan times, Moche family members endured. They survived national crisis. They kept their home fires burning as they sunk the roots of their family tree deeper into Tahosan soil.
There's a whole attitude of people, I think, has really changed in the last 25 or 26 years.
That's very interesting. Long time history.
Change is a relentless, perpetual motion engine. The West is always being reinvented by change. But for all the change, all of the gambling, family is our sole purpose on this planet. Family is our key to the future, our tie to who we are.
People of many ancestries pooled their talents and efforts to create Tahosa territory. They formed it into one of the most livable places in the world. They shaped the everyday realities of Tahosan lives and landscape. With a standard of excellence established by their ancestors, Moche family members will continue to tackle mountains of challenges and changing times in Tahosa territory.